What if I told you that the most successful psychological operation in modern history wasn't conducted by any government, but by an economic system that convinced an entire generation that their suffering was their own fault? What if the very moment you thought they just need to work harder, or if I can make it, anyone can, you were unconsciously repeating a script written by architects of inequality who needed you to believe that poverty is a personal failure rather than a systemic design? Right now, as you're listening to this, there are 38 million people living in poverty across this country. Not because they lack character, not because they're lazy, not because they made poor choices, but because they're living under an economic framework that requires their poverty to function. Yet somehow, we've been convinced that each of these millions of individual stories represents a personal moral failing, rather than the predictable outcome of policies deliberately designed to concentrate wealth upward while making the bottom blame themselves for drowning. This isn't speculation. This is the documented result of a 40-year experiment in applied psychology combined with economic policy, rooted in the theories of Milton Friedman, and implemented across every major institution in our society. The data is overwhelming. According to research from the Brookings Institution, social mobility in America has declined by 50% since 1940. The Economic Policy Institute shows that while worker productivity increased by 70% since 1973, wages for typical workers rose only 12%. Meanwhile, CEO compensation increased by 1,322%. These aren't random market outcomes. They're the predictable results of a system that Milton Friedman himself advocated, based on a fundamental law about human nature and economic choice. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. Friedman's economic theories weren't just about markets and money. They were about reshaping how we think about ourselves and each other. His doctrine of individual responsibility wasn't designed to empower people. It was designed to ensure that when the system inevitably failed most people, they would blame themselves rather than questioning the system. And it worked so perfectly that even people struggling under policies designed to exploit them will defend those very same policies while attacking themselves for not succeeding. The psychological research is clear. Studies from Harvard Medical School show that people living in high inequality societies experience chronic stress responses equivalent to trauma survivors. Research from the University of California demonstrates that economic insecurity triggers the same neurological patterns as physical threats. Yet instead of recognizing these as normal human responses to abnormal economic conditions, we've been trained to interpret our own stress, anxiety, and exhaustion as personal inadequacy. We've been convinced that our inability to thrive in a system designed to prevent thriving is evidence of our moral deficiency. But here's what they never told you about Milton Friedman's theories. Here's what gets left out of every economics textbook and business school curriculum. Friedman himself acknowledged that his theories would only work if people had equal starting points, perfect information, and genuine choice between real alternatives. He knew these conditions didn't exist. He knew his theories would create massive inequality. He implemented them anyway, because the point was never to create prosperity for everyone. The point was to create a psychological framework that would make inequality seem natural, inevitable, and most importantly, deserved. I'm going to walk you through 7 specific mechanisms by which neoliberal psychology convinced you that poverty is a personal choice, how each mechanism operates in your daily life, and why recognizing these patterns is the first step toward reclaiming both your economic reality and your mental health. Because once you understand how the system actually works, you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you stop blaming yourself for problems you didn't create and start recognizing the real sources of economic violence in your life. The first mechanism is what I call the choice illusion, and it's probably operating in your mind right now as you listen to this. Milton Friedman built his entire economic philosophy around the idea that free markets give people choices, and that poor outcomes simply reflect poor choices. Sounds reasonable, right? Except Friedman conveniently ignored what psychologists call structural constraints, the fact that real choice requires real alternative, real information, and real power to act on that information. Here's how the choice illusion works in practice. You need a job, so you choose between available positions, but you didn't choose the wage level, which have been suppressed by 40 years of anti-union policies that Friedman advocated. You didn't choose the benefit packages, which were gutted by deregulation policies that Friedman promoted. You didn't choose the working conditions, which deteriorated under the labor flexibility that Friedman demanded. You're choosing between PRE-selected options that were deliberately designed to benefit employers at your expense, but the system convinces you that this constrained selection represents genuine choice. The psychological research on choice architecture shows that people consistently overestimate their agency in situations where their options have been purely determined by others. Studies from Princeton demonstrate that when people are given a menu of bad options, they will defend their selection as reflecting their preferences rather than recognizing manipulation inherent in the menu itself. This is exactly what happens with economic choices under neoliberalism. You're choosing between different forms of exploitation and calling it freedom. Consider health insurance. You choose between plans that all require you to pay more for less coverage than your parents received from their employers 30 years ago. But instead of recognizing this as evidence that the healthcare system has been systematically redesigned to extract profit rather than provide care, you're encouraged to blame yourself for not choosing the right plan, not reading the fine print carefully enough, not being smart enough to navigate a system that was intentionally designed to be incomprehensible. The choice illusion makes you believe that your frustration with healthcare costs reflects your poor decision-making rather than policy decisions that prioritized insurance company profits over human welfare. This pattern repeats across every aspect of economic life. You choose where to live based on what you can afford, but you didn't choose the housing policies that created artificial scarcity to inflate real estate value. You choose what to study based on employment prospects, but you didn't choose the job market conditions that eliminated stable employment and created gig economy exploitation. You choose how to manage your debt, but you didn't choose the financial deregulation that created predatory lending practices. At every level, you're making choices within a rigged system, then being told that your outcomes prove the quality of your character. The second mechanism is productivity mythology, and this one is particularly dangerous because it feels so intuitively correct. Friedman argued that free markets reward productivity, meaning people who work hard and create value naturally earn more money. Therefore, people who earn less money must be working less hard or creating less value. The logical conclusion: poverty reflects laziness, while wealth reflects merit. Except the data shows exactly the opposite. Research from the Economic Policy Institute demonstrates that the lowest paid workers in America often work multiple jobs, longer hours, and more physically demanding labor than higher paid workers. Home health aides, who earn median wages of $24,000 per year, work an average of 55 hours per week in physically exhausting conditions. Meanwhile, the average hedge fund manager, who earns $690 million per year, works primarily at managing money that other people created, producing no tangible goods or services that improve anyone's life except their own. But productivity mythology isn't just about comparing different jobs. It's about convincing workers that they should constantly increase their output without expecting proportional increases in compensation. Since 1979, worker productivity has increased by 70%, but wages have increased by only 12%. Where did that extra value go? To capital owners, exactly as Friedman's theories predicted. But instead of recognizing this as organized theft, workers are told they need to be even more productive to justify better pay. This creates what psychologists call learned helplessness combined with effort justification. You work harder and harder, see minimal improvement in your economic situation, and conclude that you must not be working hard enough yet. You never consider that the system is designed to extract most of the value you create and give it to people who own capital rather than people who perform labor. The productivity mythology makes you believe that your exhaustion proves your inadequacy rather than proving the system's exploitation. The psychological impact of this mechanism is devastating. Studies from the University of Rochester show that people who internalize productivity mythology experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout because they're constantly trying to solve systemic problems through individual effort. They're running faster and faster on a treadmill that's designed to speed up every time they adapt, then blaming themselves for not reaching the destination that the treadmill was never designed to reach. The third mechanism is scarcity engineering, and this one demonstrates the sophistication of neoliberal psychological manipulation. Friedman argued that markets efficiently allocate scarce resources, but what he didn't mention is that many essential resources are only scarce because policies make them artificially scarce. Real scarcity creates competition, artificial scarcity creates desperation, and desperate people don't question the system that created their desperation. Housing provides the perfect example. There are approximately 17 million vacant housing units in this country, while 650,000 people experience homelessness on any given night. This isn't scarcity. This is engineered abundance for investors combined with engineered scarcity for human habitation. Zoning laws restrict density, tax policies incentivize speculation over occupants, and financial regulations favor corporate ownership over individual ownership. The result is artificial housing scarcity that drives up prices, forces people into debt, and creates a desperate competition for basic shelter. But here's the psychological brilliance of scarcity engineering. When resources feel scarce, people focus on competing with each other rather than questioning why the resources are scarce. Research from UCLA shows that perceived scarcity triggers tribal thinking, where people identify with their immediate in-group and view other groups as threats to their survival. This is why housing scarcity makes people blame immigrants, young people blame older people, and renters blame homeowners, instead of everyone recognizing that housing abundance is perfectly achievable through policy changes that prioritize human welfare over investor profit. Scarcity engineering operates across every essential resource. Healthcare appears scarce because we're the only developed country that treats healthcare as a profit center rather than a public service. Education appears scarce because we've defunded public education while subsidizing private alternatives. Good jobs appear scarce because we've eliminated labor protections that made jobs stable and decent paying. In each case, the scarcity is politically created, not economically necessary. The psychological impact keeps you trapped in survival mode, where you're too busy competing for artificially limited resources to recognize that abundance is being deliberately withheld. You blame other people in similar situations for taking opportunities that should be yours, instead of recognizing that there should be enough opportunities for everyone and asking why there aren't. The fourth mechanism is meritocracy mythology, and this might be the most psychologically destructive of all. Friedman promoted the idea that free markets create meritocracy, where people rise or fall based on their talents and efforts. This sounds fair and inspiring until you examine what actually determines economic outcomes in our society. Multiple studies demonstrate that economic success correlates more strongly with parental income than with individual characteristics like intelligence, education, or work ethic. Research from Harvard economist Raj Chetty shows that children born into the top income quintile have a 36% chance of staying there as adults, while children born into the bottom quintile have only a 7.5% chance of reaching the top quintile. If merit determined outcomes, these numbers would be roughly equal across all income levels. But meritocracy mythology serves a crucial core function. It allows people who succeed within an unfair system to believe they deserve their success, while convincing people who struggle in that same system that they deserve their struggle. This prevents solidarity between different economic classes, because everyone believes their position reflects their worth rather than their circumstances. The most insidious aspect of meritocracy mythology is how it affects people's self-concept. Research from Stanford shows that people who believe in meritocracy experience more shame about economic difficulty and more anxiety about future economic prospects. They're constantly evaluating themselves against impossible standards while ignoring the structural advantages that some people receive and structural barriers that others face. Consider college education, often presented as the ultimate meritocratic pathway. Students are told that educational achievement will determine their economic outcomes, creating enormous pressure to succeed academically while accumulating massive debt. But research from the Federal Reserve shows that college graduates' economic outcomes depend more on their families' economic resources during and after college than on their academic performance. Students with wealthy families can take unpaid internships, live in expensive cities, and wait for ideal job opportunities. Students without family wealth must take immediate employment regardless of fit, often in jobs that don't utilize their education. Yet when college-educated people struggle economically, they blame themselves for not knowing better, not choosing the right major, not working hard enough, rather than recognizing that the meritocratic promise was always a lie designed to make educational debt seem like a personal investment rather than a form of economic exploitation. The fifth mechanism is individualism weaponization, which takes the reasonable idea that individuals should have autonomy over their lives and transforms it into a weapon against collective action. Friedman argued that collective solutions to economic problems inevitably restrict individual freedom. Therefore, people should solve economic problems individually. This sounds empowering until you realize that most economic problems are collective by nature and impossible to solve individually. Consider retirement security. Previous generations had pensions, which pooled risk across entire workforces and guaranteed income security regardless of individual investment knowledge or market timing. Neoliberal policies eliminated pensions and replaced them with individual retirement accounts, transferring financial risk from institutions that could manage individuals who can't. The result is widespread retirement insecurity. But instead of recognizing this as a policy failure, people blame themselves for not saving enough or not investing wisely. And the psychological research on individual versus collective problem solving is clear. Studies from MIT demonstrate that individuals consistently overestimate their ability to control outcomes that depend on factors beyond their influence, while underestimating the benefits of collective action. This cognitive bias makes people vulnerable to individualism weaponization, where they convince to reject collective solutions that would actually improve their lives. Healthcare provides another clear example. Every other developed country has collective healthcare systems that provide better outcomes at lower costs than our individualized systems. But Americans are convinced that collective healthcare would restrict their freedom to choose, ignoring the fact that medical bankruptcy restricts their freedom far more than universal healthcare ever could. The weaponization of individualism makes people defend a system that bankrupts them while opposing a system that would liberate them. This mechanism is particularly effective because it hijacks legitimate desires for autonomy and self-determination. People want to feel in control of their lives, so they're attracted to ideologies that promise individual empowerment. But individualism weaponization offers fake empowerment that actually increases dependence on systems designed to exploit individual vulnerability. The sixth mechanism is success exception theory, which focuses attention on statistical outliers while ignoring systemic patterns. Friedman frequently cited examples of individuals who rose from poverty to wealth as evidence that the system works for everyone. This logic is like pointing to lottery winners as proof that lottery tickets are good investment, but the psychological impact is profound. Success exception theory works by making extraordinary achievements seem ordinary and achievable through simple effort. Media coverage of successful entrepreneurs emphasizes their hard work and determination while downplaying the advantage they received, the luck they encountered, and the systemic factors that enabled their success. This creates what psychologists call survivorship bias, where people focus on success stories while ignoring failure stories. Research from the Kaufman Foundation shows that successful entrepreneurs are overwhelmingly people who had access to family wealth, elite education, and professional networks that provided crucial support during vulnerable startup phases. But these advantages are systematically minimized in favor of narratives about individual grit and determination. The result is millions of people attempting to replicate success stories without access to the underlying conditions that made those successes possible. The psychological damage from success exception theory is severe because it makes systemic failure feel like personal failure. When people can't replicate the extraordinary achievements of statistical outliers, they conclude that they lack the character traits that supposedly enabled those achievements. Research from Yale shows that exposure to exception-based success narratives increases depression and anxiety among people facing economic difficulty because they interpret their normal responses to abnormal economic conditions as evidence of personal inadequacy. This mechanism also prevents people from recognizing patterns of systemic dysfunction. If poverty reflects individual failure, then widespread poverty must reflect widespread individual failure, rather than systemic policies that create widespread economic insecurity. Success exception theory makes systemic problems invisible by encouraging people to focus on exceptional cases rather than typical outcomes. The seventh and final mechanism is responsibility shifting, which systematically transfers accountability for collective failures onto individual shoulders. Friedman argued that government programs create dependency and undermine personal responsibility. Therefore, social problems should be solved through individual initiative rather than collective act. This framework makes people responsible for solving problems they didn't create with resources they don't have. Consider environmental destruction. Individuals are told to reduce their carbon footprints while 100 corporations produce 70% of global emissions. People feel guilty about their driving habits while transportation policy prioritizes car dependency over public transit. They stress about recycling while manufacturers design products for planned obsolescence. Responsibility shifting makes environmental destruction feel like the sum of individual choices, rather than the predictable outcome of policies that prioritize short-term corporate profits over long-term ecological stability. The same pattern applies to every major social problem. Financial insecurity is attributed to poor budgeting rather than wage stagnation. Educational achievement gaps are blamed on parental involvement rather than funding inequality. Health problems are attributed to lifestyle choices rather than environmental toxins and economic stress. In each case, individual responsibility becomes a substitute for systemic accountability. Research from Columbia University shows that people who internalize systemic responsibility for collective problems experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, and learned helplessness. They're constantly trying to solve unsolvable problems while feeling guilty about their inability to achieve impossible outcomes. The psychological burden of carrying responsibility for systemic failures is devastating individual mental health while protecting the system's failures. Responsibility shifting also prevents effective solutions to collective problems. If problems are individual, then solutions must be individual, which means collective problems never get addressed at their source. People work harder and harder to solve problems individually that can only be solved collectively, ensuring that the problems persist while people blame themselves for their persistence. Now that you understand these 7 mechanisms, let me synthesize how they work together to create what I call the neoliberal psychological matrix. Each mechanism reinforces the others, creating a comprehensive system of psychological control that makes people complicit in their own exploitation while feeling responsible for their own liberation. The choice illusion makes you believe you're free while constraining your options. Productivity mythology makes you work harder for less reward while blaming yourself for disparity. Scarcity engineering creates artificial competition while hiding artificial abundance. Meritocracy mythology makes inequality seem fair while ignoring systemic advantages. Individualism weaponization prevents collective solutions while promising individual empowerment. Success exception theory makes systemic failure invisible while highlighting statistical anomalies. Responsibility shifting makes you accountable for collective problems while protecting collective power from accountability. Together, these mechanisms create a psychological prison where the guards are inside your own mind. You police your own thoughts, regulate your own expectations, and punish yourself for failing to achieve outcomes that the system was designed to prevent. You defend the very policies that exploit you while attacking yourself for not succeeding despite those policies. You've been convinced that your poverty, your insecurity, your exhaustion, your anxiety, and your depression are all evidence of your personal inadequacy, rather than normal human responses to an abnormal economic system. But here's what changes everything. Here's what they never want you to understand. These mechanisms only work if you don't recognize them. Once you see how the psychological manipulation operates, you can't unsee it. Once you understand that your struggles are systemic rather than personal, you stop wasting energy on self-blame and start directing that energy towards systemic change. Once you recognize that millions of people are experiencing identical struggles for identical reasons, you understand that collective problems require collective solutions. The data supporting collective approaches is overwhelming. Countries with stronger social safety nets have higher levels of individual entrepreneurship, not lower. Societies with more economic equality have higher social mobility, not less. Nations with universal healthcare have more individual freedom from medical debt, not less individual choice. The neoliberal promise that individual solutions would create collective prosperity has been tested for 40 years, and the results are conclusive. It created collective insecurity and individual isolation. So here's your call to action, and it's not what you might expect. I'm not going to tell you to start a business, learn new skills, or work harder. Those might be good ideas for other reasons, but they won't solve the systemic problems that create poverty. Instead, I want you to do something much more radical. I want you to stop blaming yourself for problems you didn't create. Every time you catch yourself thinking that poor people just need to work harder, remind yourself of productivity mythology. Every time you feel guilty about your economic struggle, remember responsibility shifting. Every time you assume that successful people earn their success while unsuccessful people deserve their failure, recall meritocracy mythology. Every time you believe that individual solution can solve collective problem, recognize individualism weaponization. Start paying attention to how these mechanisms operate in your daily life, your conversation, your media consumption, and your internal dialogue. Notice how often you unconsciously repeat neoliberal psychological scripts that make systemic problems seem like personal problems. Recognize that every time you blame yourself or others for economic difficulties, you're protecting the system that creates those difficulties from the accountability it deserves. Begin connecting with other people who are experiencing similar struggles for similar reasons. Share your recognition of these psychological mechanisms. Help other people understand that their economic difficulties reflect systemic dysfunction, not personal inadequacy. Build communities of people who understand that individual healing requires collective act, and collective change requires individual consciousness. Most importantly, remember that recognizing these patterns is itself a form of resistance. Every time you refuse to blame yourself for systemic problems, you're withdrawing your psychological consent from your own exploitation. Every time you help someone else recognize these mechanisms, you're expanding the community of people who can't be manipulated by neoliberal psychology. Every time you demand systemic solutions to systemic problems, you're participating in the collective action that these mechanisms were designed to prevent. The system needs your self-blame to survive. It needs your isolation to persist. It needs your acceptance of artificial scarcity to maintain artificial abundance for the people who designed that scarcity. But it cannot survive your consciousness, your solidarity, and your refusal to take individual responsibility for collective failures. You are not poor because you lack effort. You are not struggling because you lack character. You are not anxious because you lack resilience. You are experiencing normal human responses to abnormal economic conditions that were deliberately designed to extract wealth from human labor while making that extraction seem natural, necessary, and deserved. The moment you truly understand this, the moment you stop participating in your own psychological oppression, is the moment you begin participating in your own psychological liberation. And that liberation, multiplied across millions of people who refuse to blame themselves for systemic violence, becomes the foundation for the collective action that can create systemic change. The neoliberal psychological matrix only works if you don't see it. Now you see it. Now you can't unsee it. Now you can begin the process of helping others see it too. And when enough people see it clearly, we can finally begin building economic systems that serve human flourishing rather than demanding human sacrifice. The choice is yours, but now it's a real choice, based on accurate information about how the system actually works, rather than a fake choice between purely selected options designed to benefit someone else. That's the difference between genuine freedom and the illusion of freedom. And that difference changes everything.